Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Grading the Market edition of Constellation series of energy market intelligence webinars, coming to you live from the broadcast center at Constellation headquarters in Baltimore. We hope to bring you another informative discussion on what's driving prices in the oil, natural gas, and power markets right now. Good afternoon. My name is Greg Kozier and I lead the Commodities Management Group within Constellation. I am pleased to be joined this afternoon by some of the top minds in the fields of meteorology, economics, natural gas, and power. So by way of introduction, still living off the high of a record CDD count this summer, Constellation's chief meteorologist, Dave Ryan, has just come up from the weather lab to give us the latest data he's pulling down from the Constellation satellite network. Our ear on the ground at the Federal Reserve, ready for the breaking news, our chief economist, Ed Fortunato, is joining us, and he'll give us his read on the direction of the economy and how it will affect your spending in his All Things Economic segment. And two of CMG team's fundamental experts are in residence. Brian Habasivich will bring us up to speed on production and storage, while Keith Poley is here to cover LNG developments and lead a discussion on the latest energy news from Europe. In the panel on the right side of your screen, there's a PDF copy of today's deck available for download. We have generously made a copy of the deck available for your note-taking purposes, or if you just simply like to read ahead. There's also a chat box in that panel to enter a question at any time during the presentation. Please feel free to do so and make this an interactive session. We have also provided a link to our glossary page in the chat box as a reference if you hear terms with which you are unfamiliar. And then finally, as always, we are recording this webinar and we'll email a link to all of you by the end of the week. So a couple thoughts before we start today's discussion. I think in summary, there's been a little that's happened since we were last together in July. So where to start? The U.S. has experienced a warm summer, to say the least. Dave will give us the details on that in a few minutes, but drought and heat combined a number of times this summer to set records, culminating a couple of weeks ago in California with the CalSO setting a new all-time demand record and seeing the grid push right to its edge. Wind, solar, and water forecasts have become just as important as temperature these days, as the country's two largest reservoirs in the west, Lakes Meade and Powell, continue to lose elevation. The Fed has continued to turn the dial on interest rates as they've had to confront the reality of inflation and need to cool the consumption in the economy. We also had a rail strike that would have impacted coal markets and therefore gas heavily. There was some drama around that last week. And that was until a tentative agreement was reached. And then we have the war in Europe. The war continues. The politics of natural gas flows have the needle on the tension meter in the red zone as we inch closer to winter. Concern about the availability of nat gas is at the forefront. Efforts are being made actively right now on the continent to reduce use across the entire EU, and then protests are becoming a daily event as people are unable to pay their energy bills. We should say long live the Queen, and perhaps even long live Gorbachev, both of whom passed this past couple of weeks. And the Cold War, two of the giants in the Cold War era, apparently have left us just as round two is beginning to start. So here's a quick look at how we plan to spend the next hour. Dave is in the pole position to recap the summer of heat, and if that can be used as an indicator of how weather this year will shake out for winter and perhaps the fall. And he'll also give us a read on the second half of the tropical storm season and an early winter preview. Ed is reporting live from the Federal Reserve, and
Greg, I'm going to interrupt you right now with
a decision, and we'll explain how the changes in rates is quickly hitting the consumer pocketbook.
They just raised rates 3/4 of a point.
Storage, while Keith will tell us about the second wave of LNG plants and how these plants will affect the demand outlook for gas as they come online the next couple of years. And he'll also take the lead on distilling the many market developments to come out of Europe in the last 60 days. And then the team will then grade the market in terms of these fundamentals. And like recent months, we'll talk through these items, how they can move prices for or against you, and try to help you find a signal through the noise in this environment. So by the end of the hour, we hope to leave you with a better understanding of what's happening in the markets right now so you can make better energy decisions for your business. So thanks again for joining us, and let me hand the mic to Dave for the weather.
All right, thanks, Greg. Now, it's interesting to note as we look back into the summer period here that the market has shifted over and is now using the latest census report from 2020 in terms of population-weighted CDDs. So with that, and even with the old method, this summer, either way, would have come up to be the hottest on record. Using the new method, it's 1056 population-weighted CDDs, which is, again, first hottest on record since 1950. And we did set some records in ERCOT, and most notably, of course, in California. While they didn't have their hottest summer on record, it was very close, and as Greg mentioned, it certainly stretched the grid in that area. The drought this summer impacted a little bit over in the Four Corners area in Arizona by the monsoon that's been fairly frequent in that region. However, California, much of the rest of the Southwest, continues to see moderate to severe drought. We also had a drought develop in much of the Plain States and down in Texas. They had one period of rain in Texas, which helped out slightly, but overall the drought is very prominent, as you can see in the Plain States. And newly developing dryness up in the New England area over the past few months as well. And it's interesting to note that over 70% of the nation is drier than normal in terms of precipitation over the last 6 months or so. Compare that with just 10% a year ago. So one thing that we are looking at is a change from last year to this year is much more drought in across the country. And that's not unusual given we've been in a La Nina now for about 2.5 years. So we are continuing to see mostly drier than normal weather patterns affect the U.S. And lastly, but not least, the tropics are slowly coming to life. Fiona was the first major hurricane in the Atlantic Basin this year, but it will not affect the United States. It'll probably run into Atlantic Canada over the weekend, specifically Newfoundland, and provide a very strong storm to that area. We had Gaston form overnight out of Tropical Depression 8, but it too is mostly just in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. The X that is down in the central part of the picture there on the lower part of it is the next system to watch. It is likely going to become our next named storm and is forecast to track through the Caribbean. Both of our global models take that either into the Gulf of Mexico or toward Florida. The latest European model took that up the eastern seaboard, whereas the American model had that in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. We don't have a named storm yet, so until we do, I think the entire East Coast and the eastern Gulf and Florida are all kind of in play with this system, as well as many other possibilities. But it looks like we're going to have to deal with our first possibility of a landfalling system, maybe a hurricane, as we get into next week. This tropical season is just not over with. It's a little bit slow in developing, a little bit slower than I think the market had felt, but I think overall we're still in for at least a moderately active tropical season over the next couple of weeks, and we're just not out of the woods yet. So let's look forward a little bit in terms of what is in front of us for fall. And it's very interesting that the last 5 years or so, and even longer than that, we've noticed that as far as the onset of winter is concerned, things have been a little bit shifted. Usually, winter really starts to begin in earnest after Thanksgiving. The market looks at that as a benchmark as to see where the cold air is. And for the past couple of years, it hasn't shown up. It hasn't shown up really until early January, in some cases mid-January. I remember last year we had a little bit of cold in November, but January and February were pretty cold last year. Of course, 2 years ago in 2020 was the same situation, and winter didn't really get started until the middle of January. And then it was a severe event that affected Texas late in January, early February. So we've had some delayed winter onsets and some colder springs recently. And I don't really see much of a difference this year. It looks like most of October, especially the start of it, should be pretty mild. And we may see some colder weather get involved in the east later on in the month and heading into November. But probably not the true onset of winter. We're looking at the idea that this fall is probably going to be mild overall, especially over the next 6 weeks or so. So right now we're kind of in a period where CDD and HDD counts should be a little bit lower. Having said that, though, next week is still going to feature some heat in California, and we're still seeing temperatures, as of last I looked, up in the upper 90s in Dallas this afternoon. So there's still some late season CDDs to go, but as we move into October, I would expect it to be a pretty mild month with maybe some eastern-based cold in November. So let's take a look at a preview of the winter at this point. In the top right, you can see the National Weather Service winter forecast, which is quite interesting, actually. They normally are very, very warm biased. And with that map that they are putting out, which just got updated here in the 15th of the month, showing some cold across the north and into the plain states. They have the eastern megalopolis above normal, and as well as the southwest, but they are noting some opportunities for maybe some cold across the north and into the mid-con areas, which is again, quite, I think, substantial for a National Weather Service forecast. But what has really changed over the past couple of years, other than the stronger drought at this time of year compared to last year, there's not a whole lot that has changed. La Nina is still present. It's entering its third consecutive season. When I looked at the sea surface temperature profiles, both on the Pacific and the Atlantic, they're not too much different than they were last year or the year before. However, a third year La Nina it's pretty interesting. It's only happened a handful of times over the past 70 years or so. So we really don't have a big data set for that right now. But if you do take a look at those winters, they're cold, every one of them. Mid 50s, mid 70s, mid 90s were all third year La Ninas. One of the other interesting years that comes up is 2013, the polar vortex year. In seasons and 30-year La Ninas that have a little bit of blocking, which we really can't forecast at this point, but they turn out to be very, very cold. I'm not willing to go there just yet. I think cold air has been a little bit hard to come by over the past 10 years. Not that that can't happen, but I think the overall flavor in the marketplace right now that we're getting is probably closer to the National Weather Service winter forecast at this point, which I think is fairly reasonable. But if I had to say a risk one way or the other, those third-year La Nina winters do concern me quite a bit. So I would say a variable winter is in line. I'm also very concerned about another outbreak of cold sometime early next year in the Plain States and perhaps down into Texas again. It's happened the past 2 years, and I could see that happening again. As far as the drought's concerned, I think overall we're in for another drier than normal year throughout much of the nation. But odds would favor the Northwest, at least Columbia River Basin having a decent year as far as precip's concerned. But unfortunately, it looks like California and the Southwest, the odds would very strongly favor another dry and perhaps very dry winter season, which would really exacerbate the drought in the Southwest. And in fact, it may make, if we do get a dry winter in California, it's going to make the drought probably pretty historic at this point. So as I mentioned, Texas, probably an interesting weather ahead for the plains in Texas. So I think we'll have to talk a little bit more about that in our October session.
So David, as naturally as we get closer to the winter period, your forecast, maybe your confidence level moves up a little bit more. Is there anything that you can say about the way winter arrives in a triple dip La Nina situation? Front loaded, back loaded, fairly evenly dispersed?
For sure, backloaded. But I think instead of having a longer break of warmth in December, you look at the last 2 Decembers are very, very warm. One of them being the warmest on record. And so if you're going to get a situation where you're going to get a cold winter, you need at least part of December to join in with that. But I feel it would be backloaded more toward Q1 of next year. If you look more at a 5-month strip, I think it has a better chance to turn out more like that map has on the La Nina years. But overall, we'll probably get some cold early, a little bit of a break of warmth. How long that warmth and how strong that is probably will determine the outcome of the winter. If we go with a short break of warmth and go right back into the cold again in the second half of December, and that lasts through Q1, then chances would favor the colder outcome.
All right, Dave, thank you. We will check back with you in October. All right, let's move to our man on the ground at the Fed. Ed, are you with us? How did lunch go?
Yes, I am. Yes, can you hear me?
All right, now we can hear you.
All right, great. Since we've been on the show, the Fed raised rates another 3/4 point, and they're warning their rate raise also comes with a warning saying they're going to continue to raise rates in the future. In fact, large increases in upcoming meetings. It's indicative of this will not end anytime soon. As a result, we've seen the sort of Dow Jones Industrial Average drop about 250 points on the announcement. It bounced a little bit. Now we're close to lows. Interestingly enough, the NASDAQ had rallied. Now it's back negative. So we're just seeing negative all around as far as price goes. Historically, that's a contrast to historically. Out of the last 13 interest rate raises, there've been 7 down and 6 up, and average gain of 1/3 of a point. On the day after is a different story. The S&P is usually down almost 0.75 point during that time. So there's some stuff to kind of sort through here, but just know that the Fed has promised to continue to raise rates in an aggressive manner. They didn't just say raise rates, but you can expect some more 0.75 point moves. The November meeting is coming up. It's a December meeting also, so you'd expect higher rates in both those meetings. In fact, the 0.75 point was baked in. It's exactly what we got. And this price action is probably in anticipation of what happens in November now and not what they just announced. So that's where we are right there.
So Ed, with interest rates going up 75 basis points, that puts the target rate now above 3%. First time we've been there in 13, 14, 15 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it has been it's been about a generation of time. And, it probably, by the time they're done, you're probably between 4 and 5%, in their efforts to kind of slow this thing down. So we need to, get used to keep raising rates right here. So this isn't turning around anytime soon. I know there had rumors in the summer when we had the summer rally, the Fed was going to turn around, the Fed was going to start to stimulate, but they are going aggressively after inflation, and they want it back in that 2% range.
All right, so we know interest rates going up, that has an effect on things that are linked to debt. So credit card rates are going to move quickly. Mortgage rates, car rates are going to move quickly as well. Tell us a little bit about what you see happening to payments and how that'll affect spending in the economy.
So in 50 words or less, I want to get into the minutia of GDP. There are big chunks of GDP. I'm always focused on cars, and used cars and new cars are one of them. That's about $1.5 trillion worth of our economy. You add new cars in, which are about 700 billion, and that's about 12% of our total economy. Houses add another 12% to the total. And those are very interest rate sensitive products just because you need so much money to borrow. You move on to, medicine's about 20%, or medical. Food is 10, government spending's 20, businesses are 10%. Energy is about 10% and about 85%. So everything else in the economy outside of houses, cars, and what other people are doing is taken up by houses and cars. So that's why it's so important to look at this. In fact, the 10-year yield on the Treasury is really pretty much set on mortgages. So that's how dedicated it is. The front end of the curve, the Fed can manipulate, but the back end of the curve is really what mortgage demand's doing. And you see the 2-year rate hit 2% or 4% this year, or this week. You're looking at 10-year Treasury is 3.5%. So the yield curve is inverted, which doesn't incentivize bank lending, and all of a sudden you have this big contraction in the market. In fact, when yield curves get inverted, and I don't want to go into detail on this, it's when short-term rates are higher than long-term rates, and that just kind of goes against just natural borrowing and lending practices. And that usually shuts lending down because banks borrow short-term and lend long-term. And when they lose money, in that process, they're not going to be very aggressive lenders. So that's what we have right here.
And that impacts mortgage payments, as you've got on the screen, because now the rates have basically doubled, if not even closer to, doubled from where they were a year ago.
Yeah, pretty much doubled. And you can see how much more expensive they are right now. And it's, if you need to buy a house, you're not going to not buy a house if you can possibly afford it. But the extras go away. That extra bedroom, that extra piece of property that's attached to it, the niceties that you dream about now become just necessities. And as a result, you kind of lower your borrowing footprint. And since GDP is really just the size of transactions added up across the economy, as the size of the transactions gets smaller, as we illustrated from about a $450,000 house to about a $280,000 house, it's going to be smaller. So it'll be a slower GDP, and that's how you slow things down. If you look at automobiles, it's the same story.
Yep. I was just you downsize in terms of what you're buying for a car.
Yes. You look at, that's a Ford Explorer on there. I wanted to use a $50,000 car, and a Ford Explorer ranges between $45,000 and $65,000. So it's right in the middle. And when interest rates are low, the $50,000 car costs as much as the $43,000 car when interest rates are high. So you'll still buy the car, but you might get the XLT version instead of the limited or the big fancy version with all the options that you dream about. You still need to get around. In fact, as far as cars go, used cars are probably the best barometer to talk about when you're looking at about inflation and deflation. And from July to August, you saw a substantial decline in price of used cars. they moved down from about 32,500 to 28,000. But it's still 9% higher than year over year. So you're still getting the inflation indicator, even though the prices are starting to come down. And they're starting to come down. You see less used cars being sold at a lower price. You also see the same amount of new cars. So it's not like you've solved the chip shortage in any material way or the production of new cars. It's just people are kind of slowing down buying right here. And that's what you're starting to see. And that's what the goal of the Fed is right now.
Right. So you're getting less for more, and your consumption is falling.
And that's exactly what's happening. And that shows up on GDP figures. And then you move to housing, you see, just more, as you move to shelter, you're just looking at, a struggle to kind of, just rent the house or buy a house. Either way, it's keep getting more and more expensive. And there are some indications that the rental market's slowing down. There's been aggressive building in some areas of the country on the rental units. There's been more aggressive, pricing in real estate at some points as far as prices of rentals go. But overall, there's just not a big break in inflation, and that's why the Fed's going to keep chasing this until it slows down. You can see the yield.
With the approach of winter, we're probably going to, in our next webinar, I want to take a look at the practical impacts of utility bills at this point, because that's going to pull a lot of consumption out of the general economy.
When you're talking, I mentioned that energy expenditures are about 10%. They have been 7%. And basically, any money you don't spend on energy goes to disposable income purchases, like pizzas or trips to Disney or, just extras for the family. And you see that show up, in all the statistics very consistently all the time. And this should be no different this time. And, the last chart we show here on this page, we're just showing the increase in interest rates. And no matter what, whether you're buying a Ford or a Ferrari, whether you're buying a small house or a big house, unless you're just some incredibly wealthy person, it comes down to your monthly mortgage payment or your monthly car payment. And, if interest rates go up, the price of those things has to go down to adjust for what the monthly payment is.
Hey, Ed, just so people understand, post the Fed announcement here, the 2-year went from 4 to 4.1%, and the 10-year hit 3.6, ticked up. So there's a 0.5 spread there on the inversion there between 10-year.
And that's really
on that chart, we're now off the top of that.
Yeah,
chart.
we're at 3.6 on that chart. We're above that chart. So that's
and it's just whatever the rate is, that curve's still inverted, which discourages lending from banks. So on top of higher rates, now you're going to have more hurdles to pass through to get the lending that you want. It's just not going to be easy to go buy a car or a house as it was a year ago.
All right, Ed, thank you very much. Let me hand it to Brian. He's going to tell us a little bit about what's happening in production, another area where we've seen some decreased spending in recent months.
Well, thanks, Greg. So I think I've talked to, and we spoke to in the last webinar, through the noise, the market's looking for the signal, and the signal is production. And why wasn't production really responding robustly and outperforming expectations in the first half of the year relative to what amounts to 2 doublings in natural gas prices, and also a robust crude oil market as well. And we've talked endlessly about the newfound discipline in producers. I won't reiterate that, but producers are spending their money on buying shares back and paying dividends and rewarding investors and reducing debts as opposed to continuous drilling. But I think one of the big stories right now over the last 2 months is that production has in fact begun to make what is an iterative and meaningful response to the upside, particularly in the last 2 months, and is beginning to give some confirmation to that increase in output. And as you can see in the upper right-hand side of the upper left-hand diagram, so U.S. dry gas production in BCF a day, the short-term energy outlook, the STEO, as we call it, from the EIA, is looking at 98.7, close to 99 BCF a day
by the end of the year. Yeah.
By the end of the year. And when you can see that as we went along the trajectory of the dotted line in February, March, April, May, the market wanted to see it above that line. The market wanted to see a response, more of a response to the then rising prices than it was seeing. And so, and again, the market was fairly tight on the supply demand balance basis, but it wanted to see above the dotted line. It didn't get there. Prices went up again. But now we're getting some response, as you can see on the green line there. The market is responding to higher prices. The rig counts are going up, as you can see on the right-hand side. We're still below pre-pandemic levels, but we're still getting a lot of action in the Haynesville Shale. Appalachia is basically flat in terms of rigs, but we are getting a response, as you can see, post-COVID. You can see July 20th there on the x-axis on the right-hand side, and a recovery in drilling. Still not, again, pre-COVID levels, but getting there. So through the noise, the market's looking for the signal. The signal has been production. It's starting to get that. Now you're getting 2 consecutive months of month-over-month real increases. We had a 1.4, 1.5 BCF a day month-over-month in August increase to production. We are now at about a 1 BCF a day, more or less, month-over-month increase in the month of September. When you combine those two things, that's pretty significant. And so the market wants to see that continue and to get to 100 more or less, 99, 100 BCF a day by the end of the year. If it fails that, if it starts to go the other way and it starts to track downward and or flatten out and not get better, not increase from here, that's a bullish signal heading into winter. If it exceeds expectations and hits 100 or 101 at the end of December, that should be, all other things being equal, because Dave would come in with the weather and say, hey, if we have an early kickstart to winter, you could be 100 BCF a day. It's not going to matter because winter will overwhelm it. But all of the things being equal, that would be bearish if you were to exceed production. But again, there's all kinds of risks around this. That's why you have to watch it every month and score it accordingly. So then when you look at storage, well, I spoke with the team earlier. I said there's nothing more really boring than storage sometimes. I still think that's the case to some extent.
Unless you're going to undershoot.
Unless you're going to undershoot,
Yeah.
which I don't think you're going to do at this point. Undershooting meaning coming in significantly below the 5-year average, which is somewhere around 3.5 trillion cubic feet in underground storage by the end of October. We're going to be at 3.4-ish, 3.5-ish, somewhere around there, looking at 3.429. And so that's not that remarkable. But so what does it mean? Well, it means that Katie bar the door, we're running out of gas? No. It means that, hey, we're pushing gas out of the fish's gills? No. But it means that we have adequate storage, but that the market still feels uncomfortable, or at least supportive at the current kind of pricing action with the storage numbers that we're forecasting at 3.429 trillion cubic feet in underground storage. So it's not an end of the world number, but it's certainly not a number that brings comfort to a tight, tense market and with respect to other things. Additionally, demand for natural gas has continued to grow significantly. And if you look at the right-hand side from 2014 coming into 2022, which is the all-time demand year record, you can see about a 23% increase over the period 2014 through 2022 in demand for natural gas. Power demand, obviously a big one. Industrial demand is very robust and continues to grow. And that has to do with reshoring and some of the things we've talked about with respect to American industry and things that continue to be forecast to be good for the United States, because despite very high energy prices in many other parts of the world, we are still very low relative to them. Even though they're much higher, we're still a lot lower than the competition globally. So, and this doesn't take into account exports as well. And if you tack exports onto this, then you can really see why we're producing 97, 98-ish BCF a day. But when you throw the exports on top of those demand numbers domestically, that's why the demand balance is so tight. It's very tight supply-demand balance throughout the year, and the pricing action has expressed that.
Yeah, and one of the things that's probably worth mentioning, I mean, your comment about how we're slightly, call it a couple hundred BCF, likely to undershoot on the total storage number by the end of the injection season, which is the end of October. One of the numbers that sort of is hidden in that is that the East is fairly well below in their storage. So as we look about how storage is dispersed throughout the US, the Eastern numbers are running 60 to 70 BCF behind where they've been traditionally in the last few years. That's a gap that's unlikely to be closed between now and the end of the injection season. That's going to keep pressure on, especially in the Northeast. Obviously, New York, New England markets, very sensitive to storage, very sensitive to gas prices. So that's something that's sort of hidden in these numbers that folks who are listening to this that have Northeastern exposure either on the gas or the power side need to be aware of.
And
Also
increasingly,
Michigan storage too for
And-
Chicago, and if that gets cold in Chicago, then you got low Michigan storage.
In the Midwest market, right? And we saw the National Weather Service map that Dave gave us, and they were generally warm, they generally lean warm, but yet they had cold in the Midwest and the Mid-Con.
Yeah,
And
and if there is going to be a little bit of early season cold, I would favor the east or northeast on that.
but I would also add to that the Northeast has considerable amount of now pain associated with European gas prices, because the last marginal unit that can get to New England, for instance, is through the terminal at Boston Harbor. And so that's playing a role in the exacerbated pricing in New England. And then it also spills into the Mid-Atlantic, because if you're competing then in the Mid-Atlantic for that BTU as well. So we're again seeing for the first time the real impacts of the United States' role as the global LNG leader.
Excellent. Speaking of LNG,
Speaking of
Keith,
LNG, yeah. So,
that's your cue.
well, okay. So since our last webinar in July, a couple of newsworthy events. Freeport came out and said that they had reached an agreement. Now partial return was moved up from October 1st to November 1st, most likely. TBD. We'll see how it comes in. So stay tuned on that. Renewable Energy have requested an exemption for its turbines at its Freeport, the Sabine Pass and Corpus Christi terminals. They own both of those sets of those. These are the gas turbines that are cooling the natural gas into LNG. They were exceeding their emissions limits. They've been running above capacity to try to get as much LNG out to Europe as possible. This rule had been stayed for 18 years. They lifted the stay earlier this year. EPA is going to work with LNG on mitigation measures, but the market sold off $2 on the news. We'll get into more of that later, how the market is increasingly sensitive to any of these news events. Calcasieu Pass brought in the remaining liquefaction trains, all its trains online ahead of schedule in early August. We've been averaging 11.1 BCF a day so far, first half of this year per EIA. Now, I've got 3 more trains that are under construction. Golden Pass started a year ago. It's furthest along. It's ExxonMobil's. That's the first train will come online, 0.8 BCF a day in early 2024. Plaque McCain's was 1.9 will start in 2024. These are smaller module trains, not as large as the Golden Pass ones and some of the other existing ones. And then Corpus Christi Stage 3 will start in 2025. So you're going to get 3 to BCF of capacity by the end of 24, maybe 2.5. But by end of 25, you'll be at 6 BCF a day of additional capacity. So what Brian talked about, product growth that the market's looking for is demand. It's going to end this year maybe at an all-time high. We've got this further demand coming now, and will production, catch up?
So
there?
the takeaway here is that roughly 2 years out, we're getting another 50% LNG demand coming into the stack.
Yes.
And we didn't necessarily show it on the gas production slide a couple minutes ago, but do we have, Brian, do we have line of sight to seeing another 6, 7, 8 BCF of production coming online in the next 12 to 24 months?
We do, with a lot of caveats. You've got to have the takeaway capacity built into the Marcellus, and that's the key. And without that, you're not going to have it. You're going to be short.
They're drilling in Haynesville, but there's only so much they can probably do there to increase production.
And there's not a lot of announcements on takeaway capacity in Appalachia right now. So that's a big caveat on top of the caveat.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other thing I think I would draw the eye to, using the graphic on the right in the map of where these plants are located, Dave, there's probably some sensitivity there to hurricane activity in the Gulf, and so storms that make landfall in the Gulf, storms that enter the production zone 10, 15 years ago, that was a big impact from a supply side standpoint. Now that could be obviously an enormous impact for a storm that hits the right part of the Gulf. even if it doesn't do much damage, just simply slowing down the movement of ships in and out of the Gulf
Yeah.
is going to have a big impact on demand.
So flooding, right?
Could be an ultra bearish situation.
If the river currents are too strong, Coast Guard won't let the LNG ships in. Not safe to dock them. So
The hurricanes are bearish.
have been, yeah.
Unbelievably.
Yeah, that's true.
And we may have to, like I said earlier,
Well, I
deal with
can't-
that next week.
I can't tell you how many times I've talked to different customers about that and explained why that is, and noted that the offshore production is almost nothing today relative to what it was even 20 years, 15 years
from
ago.
natural gas.
From natural
standpoint.
gas,
Yeah,
yes.
right.
Yes. So hurricanes are now bearish, which is
You have to reset sort of the mindset for hurricanes in the Gulf.
correct.
Okay, so turning to Europe.
So speaking of hurricanes,
Yeah. Some fish storms may make it over to the UK there.
Yeah.
The coming storm.
Natural gas supply. So looking at the situation in Russia, pipeline flows. This is the system gas operators for Europe that EIA refers to for references in some of their articles. We look at gas flows early 2022. Nord Stream 1 was flowing approximately 5.3 BCF a day. Q2, you had about 2.25 BCF a day coming from Russia through Ukraine, still flowing to Poland and Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Bulgaria, and then some still coming through to Turkey there as well. If you look at midsummer, Nord Stream 1 was down to 1.1 BCF a day. We're sending about 1.5 through Ukraine. Again, prices are rising, so Russia doesn't need to move as much gas to earn more revenue. And then if we look here, we look at now through the first 5 to 10 days of September, you have about 1.5 moving through Ukraine, 0.5 BCF a day moving into the Baltics there, and some still flowing through Turkey into the Black Sea there. But there is gas still flowing. But Russia, one hand, Russia has played maybe a big part of their energy card by shutting down Nord Stream 2 on the compressor station there. They have after the maintenance right around Labor Day, they haven't brought it back. But the situation is fluid. We're going to continue to watch this. They're making up for it with, and we had obviously LNG imports from the U.S. and around the world, but it's coming out of Norway and North Africa is going to be pretty consistent over the midterm here. There was a large field in Holland that the Dutch are still planning to close, but 5 years ago was supplying the daily needs of Germany. So Europe is in for a significant event. There is a clip here to an interview with General David Petraeus about his view on the Ukraine conflict mid-September. People can take a look at that if they want. And European storage right now is about 85% full, which is we'll get into it here, slightly above where they were hoping to be November 1st. They've got some November 1st targets. Germany gets, 50% of its LNG, or sorry, gas supplies was getting it from Russia prior to February last year. That Italy, those countries are dependent, but the European Union's trying to figure out how these guys are going to share critical gas supply, ration it if necessary. Utilities there in Germany are talking about having even government backing to be able to make collateral payments. Storage is going to be tight, but it depends how cold does it get and when does it get cold, how soon does it get cold in Europe, just like here for this winter.
So this chart's important because it plays into the next slide where you talk a little bit about pricing.
Right.
I think the takeaway here is that even though we've seen the dramatic change in flows, they've dropped dramatically because of the major pipelines that come into Europe from Russia. We've seen the flows decrease over the last 6 to 12 months. They still made their storage targets. So clearly there's been some impact on industry, which I know you're going to cover in just a second. But the takeaway from this is that this has been one of the contributing factors to, I think, European prices, even Asian prices declining some point, is because Europe was able to they've cut back, they've made their storage targets as of September 1. They're in a fairly good position to make their November 1 storage targets. That's great from a beginning of winter standpoint. Depending on how Dave dictates their weather for this coming winter, we'll see how long those stockpiles last.
Right.
But now tell us a little bit about how that's impacted industry and impacted pricing on the TTF and the
sure.
JKM markets.
Well, because yes, they have storage helps, but they've built their system relying on pipeline imports, so that's not going to be there this winter. You see here from the chart on the left, industrial demand through August here, and you can see Germany is the dark blue part of the belt. It's the majority. It's manufacturing sector heavily weighted to the auto industry and machinery. A lot of that going to China. A significant pullback started in July and August as prices rose. When we look here on the chart on the right, the light blue bar is the line is TTF. It's in Holland. JKM, which is lagged at, is the black line. But again, as Asia needs to tighten up supplies for winter, we could see upward pressure there. The Brent equivalent in dollars per MMBTU is the red line. And you can see how the TTF and JKM both found support there, bounced off Brent prices there in June. And then down about in the orange line there is Henry Hub. So $10 was still the cheapest BTU in the world. But we're facing higher prices already now in utility bills and high prices this winter. The Europeans are in a much different scale. And there's a Wall Street Journal article there today. I put a link to it here. Again, European manufacturers looking to move to the U.S. There's a Dutch fertilizer company cited in an earlier article that was going to back down production in Holland and triple the production in their Beaumont, Texas facility next year.
Yeah,
of 2023.
And that hits on a topic that I know Brian has commented on fairly extensively recently, which was just the reshoring of industrial demand out of Europe, potentially back to the States.
Well, and beyond that, the narrative currently feels like, well, we're going to get through this winter and then this will be resolved because we'll get more LNG. This does not get resolved after winter. This is a 5 to 10 year, and I think 10-year problem, and will require a heavy reliance on fossil fuels to get them through. And they're going to have to figure that out and come to that realization. I also think that all of the quote unquote solutions, and I know we talked about this internally, that, well, they talked about price caps, but they're not going to do that. And they talked about windfall profits taxes, they're not going to do that. But the fact that they're talking about those things as potential solutions tells me that they have not the capacity to deal with it. Nationalizing assets.
And they've pulled the playbook out of from the 70s off the shelf.
And that's why we should have played, "Staying Alive" as the entry song to the broadcast, because that would have been a great entry. Nationalizing assets. Look, Germany just nationalized Uniper this morning. That's the second largest LDC they have 4 basically large.
And we saw France with EDF
of course,
a couple of weeks ago.
Yes. So nationalizing assets, that's also part of the playbook from the 70s. Price caps, windfall profits tax on suppliers, nationalizing assets. And the real problem is they need more supply. And all of the things that they've proposed as remedies do the exact opposite. They make everything worse. And that's so it's going to take a tough winter maybe to get people to realize that we're going to have to do something radical because the situation is so bad.
And even building LNG import terminals is going to take 3, 4, 5, several years to build a
They still can't build enough import terminals to match the Russian load.
If you remember the 70s and the oil shortages, it took a good 10 years to dig their way out of those shortages, and it just became for new production. And the same thing goes for in the early 2000s. There was a 5 or 6 year issue with short product, and it took more production to come online. And until we get that, in whatever form that is, we need to replace what's being lost right here.
So Ed, you're gonna have to get us a disco ball for the next broadcast, because we're going back to disco.
Sounds good. I'm from Brooklyn. That's the home of them.
All right. So if we look at the chart that Keith had up on the screen just a second ago, that number that had Henry Hub is the cheapest BTU in the world. If you double click on that a little bit, you do see some volume. There you go. Yeah, right where you were. There you go. Easy on the coffee, Keith. All right. So gas prices right now finding support in coal. What does that mean? Explain that for folks.
So it's the equivalent of a power dispatcher can say, okay, I'm going to run my coal unit today, run my gas unit, the cost equivalent of coal versus gas to make electricity based on the 2 different heat rates, 7.5 for a gas turbine, 10 for a coal unit. Right now, with where coal prices are, because there's limited coal supply, coal floor is probably about $7.50. Ed, Brian, and I were talking about it before the show. We showed it in the last webinar. You see the market's found support there around $7.50. Peaking around 10, and news stories are moving it either way. coal, but coal's going to take. I mean, opening a new mine is not. It's going to take time if coal producers can get the financing to do it, and they want to commit to it because they're going to need long enough time frame. So there's less coal. We've retired over 70 gigawatts of coal units in the last 10 years in this country. So there's less coal to back up the growing, demand to display again for growing backup renewable production, which is intermittent. So that's a support, but it's a higher level right now. It's based on what Brian's saying, how they're going to need to burn coal in Europe for the next couple of winters. Probably is going to stay there for some period of time here. So
in other words, there's not a lot of downside right now to gas prices. Gas prices have basically declined to that coal floor.
Right, maybe a really warm November, December sees it drift lower, but any signal that shows cold air coming out of Canada, buckling the jet stream, this market's going to turn around and move up.
Well, I want to
Viciously, yeah.
Yep. Go ahead, Brian.
I want to chime in and just say that the floor doesn't mean prices can't get below the floor. What the floor represents is if prices were to get below the floor, demand for natural gas goes up and starts to rebalance the market again. So it's an agent to rebalance demand for natural gas, which then would tend to bring prices back up to the floor. So prices can in fact go below the floor.
Yeah.
There's a point in time where you could come up with any scenario, warmest winter since 1950. Well, if you have the warmest winter since 1950 and you start off warm in November and continue on through on a heating degree day basis, supply is going to overwhelm demand for natural gas and you're going to go below that floor. But demand for natural gas will then consequently rise and start to rebalance that coming into the end of the first quarter. So I want to be careful that that's not an absolute floor it can't get below. It certainly can.
But until you see winter weather.
The equilibrium point.
Correct.
Is the coal floor.
And the floor is rising over time. So that's another.
It used to be
feature.
$4.
Yeah, it used to be $4. Now it's a lot higher than that.
So Ed, you were trying to break in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, just you got to remember though, Brian makes a point of weather's going to determine this. And, we have a situation right now. You look at storage, we're not going to have a calamity with storage, but if we get a cold winter, it's going to get really, really tight and prices will reflect that. If we have a very warm winter, prices will reflect that too. And the same thing goes for coal to gas switching right now. And you need to determine what the winter weather brings to figure that out. And between September 20th and November 20th is just speculation and forecasts and things like that. So it's really just market dynamics and panic in the market or relaxation in the market that's going to determine prices over the next little while. So the coal floor is probably the best you can do as far as cheap prices go.
Yep, excellent point, Ed. Keith, let's talk a little bit about power, and then we need to do some marking and grading.
Yes, we do. Okay, so looking at our Cal 23 through 26 strips, we show, again, the market remains backwardated with 23 trading over pretty much in most markets over 24, then 25, 26 are all close, much tighter spreads there. I think the blue lines are representing Cal 23 across all markets, represents the uncertainty you see in the first half of the year, especially the first quarter. That isn't going to change. I think, as Dave said, if the drought does not get better or worsens in California and Texas, there's a lot of upside risk for balance to 23 there for sure. And I think you would see 24 move accordingly, kind of in tandem.
Across all markets.
Across all markets.
Certainly, as the wintertime period develops, clearly calendar 24 could break out on all these charts, just like you see it happening right now in New England.
Yes.
As 24 prices begin to move higher.
Yeah. And in our appendix, we have NYMEX 2023 and all different power markets, and it's still a very tight, like plus 90% correlation there. So as NYMEX goes, it's going to drive these forward prices.
All right, fantastic. All right, let's talk about grading. So in an effort to sort of crystallize and summarize exactly what we've covered over the last, 2-3 hours, we're going to take each of our subjects and we're going to assign each one of them a grade. We're going to talk a little bit about how that GPA at the end could be considered in your portfolio view of the world. So from a weather standpoint, Dave, don't take this personally. We've marked you as a C-. And so, as we think about how the weather could potentially develop right now, you've got risks for colder clearly, some parts of the world could be much colder, but overall, you've got these colder risks in the weather forecast. So we're gonna grade that as a C- right now. We'll see how you do in October. Maybe we mark you higher if you get a little bit more bearish in your weather forecast, fewer heating degree days. But right now, I think we've got enough upside risk that we're gonna call that a C-.
Yeah, I like the colder risk in the weather forecast right now.
Okay, so Ed, from an economics perspective, in
Not doing much better.
in our economic theory, we're marking you as a C. And again, I hope you don't take that personally.
It reflects my high school and college grades, no problem.
And again, I think one of the points you've made in the past has been that the economy doesn't necessarily dictate a great deal of energy demand change, but overall, we recognize that there could be significant changes in GDP, and then that can have carryover effects to how people think about maybe expanding their production of energy.
Yes, and on top of it, you have, Brian and Keith have both mentioned we have the cheapest BTU in the developed world. We're going to keep seeing industrial processes coming our way, which is going to support, demand for energy right now. So it kind of throws a wrench into the typical, recession type of behaviors.
Even in the undeveloped world, Ed, and we're both. I guess you look at the undeveloped world, look at their prices. They're very high.
No, I'm just saying industrialized world because that's where we compete for industrial processes.
Pakistan can't compete for LNG now. They're burning fuel oil.
Right.
So, they're back to burning dung again. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
China's got some problems as they continue to fight the virus.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. With hard lockdowns. Makes you wonder if they know something we don't about the virus. All right. So geology. Brian, we let you cover this when we're calling geology production, and what you can get in terms of minerals out of the ground.
Despite that being contrary to how I actually performed in school, I'll take it.
You'll take the A-, so that
yeah, I'll
take
the A-. I'm the kid who's had to change an F into a B on my report card. So you can do. Even your parents will buy it.
So you did well in creative writing.
Yes.
All right, so we marked Brian as an A-, and from a storage perspective, storage shaping up fair. Called that middle of the road a C. It looks like it's going to undershoot. It's not going to undershoot a great deal, but nonetheless, the way it looks right now is probably coming in at a C level. Europe, Keith, Europe.
I did Europe broad. It didn't do good. Good in life.
You need some remedial help in Europe, Keith.
Yeah, Keith. See me after class. We will.
The European situation has, apparently no good outcome at the moment. And the news this morning was perhaps a full mobilization of the Russian army, something we haven't seen since World War II. The markets have not reacted to that very strongly, whether in gas, oil. I mean, even the stock market following the news today, we were, Ed, I think you said we were off 250 points at one point. Now we're up 175 on the Dow.
Yeah, we've changed around. That's all Fed stuff. That has nothing to do with it. In fact, when Putin, if you got in stocks, when Putin announced the mobilization and the annexation, the MOEX, which is the Russian equivalent of the S&P 500, dropped 10% to its lowest level, even after they invaded. And it's just it's not looking good over there.
Yeah, so it's not a good situation. Clearly, there are upside risks, even if the market may be minimizing them quite right at this particular moment from gas, oil, or even equity prices. But nonetheless, nothing positive about the European situation at the moment. And
Yes.
and then for the last class, we'll call that growth and development. This is really LNG. LNG, this is sort of a counterintuitive grade. Like the outlook for LNG, if you're an LNG producer, is really quite good. It's probably an A.
Demand has never been better.
The landscape looks like an A.
People are knocking on your door.
Correct.
Sign contracts.
But from the buyer's perspective, when we approach this discussion from the outlook of the consumer, it's sort of a C- environment, because you're looking at increased demand, as we talked about. About 50% more LNG demand comes into the equation over the next 24 months. For a buyer, that's very price supportive. That's not necessarily a great environment to be in. So as we look at these 6 grades and we calculate a total GPA for this first marking period, we're at about a 1.9, using the traditional scale of equating numbers and GPAs. On the thermometer of GPA, if you call a 4.0 a bearish situation where good grades and all of these things, and again, LNG can be a little counterintuitive. A bearish grade is very good for the consumer, and we're not necessarily there. We're a little bit below the midpoint, so not quite a C, but approaching that level. So again, referring back to Brian's high school and college days, you're sort of in the midpoint with risk to the upside, and there are clearly things that could happen from the weather perspective, and the situation in Europe to take that to an F-, where it could become much more bullish as we look out over the next few months. So we'll
Greg,
revisit.
let me make a point here as far as just these fundamentals kind of have us fairly neutral to kind of leaning bullish. The market itself, the option market itself, has the $30 call being priced the same amount as the 450 put. And it just tells you that there's as good a chance as 30 as 450. So there's some upside here, and there's still some panic in this market, even though right now we're fairly neutral going into the winter.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And that's for January, right?
January 2023, yeah, for winter.
Right.
And we're sitting here at 72 degrees and beautiful out most part of the country. So there is no pull on gas. So things ease up a bit. That doesn't mean winter's going to be like that.
All right. So with some time for questions, and we do have a few, let me toss off a couple softballs for Keith, our LNG expert. Cove Point maintenance. It's on the board for October, I believe. That's going to shave a little bit off the demand profile. It's a fairly short-lived event. I think they've got a few weeks on the board.
I mean, it's probably priced in. So that Cove Point or any units in the Gulf, anything that delays any kind, would bring delay to any project would definitely put a downward pressure on the market.
All right. Brian, portfolio question for you. My contract ends in November. What should I do next?
You have a little bit of a runway maybe because it's September and it's nice out and we've had a lot of softness. But again, if you're looking for prices to go back to 3 or 4, you're looking in the wrong place. So on the margin, you could pick up some additional value. At the same time, it's a risk management discussion. It's not a pick the market discussion. It's never a pick the market discussion. And that's where people get into trouble because they want to pick the market and they want to pick the low price and they want to be the winner. Well, that's not the kind of market we're in, number one. And this market is extremely volatile. We have a tremendous amount of headline risk in this market. We could wake up tomorrow and there could be a headline that could really boost the market or drop the market. So I have said this 1,000 times on this show and everywhere else. I can't be 100% right. Don't be 100% wrong. And therefore, I want to own a significant chunk of winter at a significant discount, a 2-month low, as I'm in the month of September. I'm in a 2-month low right now. So I think there's a little bit potential more to go. I do. Do I know that that's going to happen? I don't. And do I know when and by how much? I don't. I know what I have in front of me. And I have a significantly lower price in front of me now than I had 2 months ago. And I have the same risks that I had 2 months ago right now. I want to buy some of that. I want to make it meaningful. And I want to make it that I have something in my back pocket if things go wrong.
Does that perspective change at all for the wintertime period over, say, November, December?
Yes, but I have risk in waiting that long. I have a lot of risk in waiting that long because every day that I wait is an unknown as opposed to having a known in my back pocket, which is supply at a fixed price of some fixed price that I know.
Okay. Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, I was talking to a customer the other week, and they said, "Sure, wait till after November elections to buy." And I said, "Well, anything post-election is going to be influencing 23, 24, 25. If you're open for this winter, you don't want to be waiting until November because you'd be on top of winter then and much more sensitive to any kind of cold forecast and could drive things higher."
Well, I'll chime in and just say I think it would be a very bad idea to post a purchasing decision on the midterm elections for any reason, one way or the other. They're not going to have it. Doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Can we go back to the report card for just a second? Because we had a couple of questions coming in on. So if we just go up a couple slides right there. So you had a couple questions coming in again on the bearish and bullish thermometer on the right. So the thought here is that taking that GPA, we're assigning it a place on that, call it that entire GPA scale. So bullish would be a 0, bearish would be a perfect 4.0. The thought behind this is that as the GPA increases, you're moving to a more bearish environment. So from a buyer's perspective, that should bring prices down, should decrease volatility. It should make it a more attractive marketplace. And our summation of the grades at this point was such that we thought there would be more risks to the upside than to the downsides as we look at the market environment today. So I hope that helps folks understand it. And we'll, like I said, I think we'll revisit this in the coming months. Keith, another quick, easy one for you. And we talked a little bit before the show in the green room about you potentially moving coal on your boat this winter as coal prices and the need for additional barges
on the barge.
Yeah,
the Chesapeake Bay
has increased. Jones Act. Explain what that is quickly for folks, and
the Jones.
Is there any chance that gets waived, temporarily set aside?
That's always talked about, but it's about U.S. flag vessels have to transport products, goods within U.S. waters, and it's
between U.S. ports.
U.S. ports, and it's limited. Like we can't, you can't move LNG from Louisiana Cove Point to Boston Harbor as easily, like because of that. I think it would take an act of Congress to repeal that 1920s law.
I don't know. We just got rid of all student debt with it. So why get Congress involved in these things? We can do them.
That's right. The king decreed. Right.
Right.
All right. So we'll take one. Oh, here you go. This is an easy one. Ed, is there gas fracking in Europe?
No, not really. Some marginal stuff. The UK said they were going back to explore it again because they do have shale gas reserves. There's plenty of them there. They just haven't decided against it as far as their environmental policy. But the UK has decided that they're going to go back and revisit it and see if they can get some gas out of the ground that way.
I think Poland had some shale reserves. I don't know
Poland's got reserves, but they don't have the infrastructure. Even if they fracked, they don't have the infrastructure to move it.
Right.
They don't have pipelines, anything like that. No.
Chevron had a couple of fracked wells in Poland. They were testing it. But at the time, they couldn't deliver the gas at the market. Now the market's different, number one. They also fracked a couple of wells in eastern Germany and had some success. But again, they couldn't clear the then price with the cost. That's different as well.
So they don't even have contract law as far as mineral rights go. It'll be a long road to get there.
But the UK actually has fracked and had success, but they stopped it. So they can produce gas economically. So there's going to be a real, one of the first things that the new prime minister just did was she said, lifted the ban on fracking.
Lifted the ban on
That's
fracking.
right.
Yeah. They're going to explore it.
All right. So we have made full use of our 60-minute hour yet again. And if we were not able to address your question during today's call, we have record of it. We'll respond to you directly and post the most popular Q&A to the blog. If you think of a question later, you can email the team directly at the address you see on the screen right there in front of you. And right after this broadcast, you'll have an opportunity to take a survey. We will thank you in advance for your responses. We do read them. And as you can see on the slide, our next scheduled broadcast is on Wednesday, or October 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Buy your tickets now for the best seat selection. And as I'm required to by his contract, you can see a plug for the next installment of Fortunato and Friends there on the screen as well. Sure to be another insightful discussion with a couple of our regulatory experts, and David and David.
And they're good. They do know what's going on in DC.
And
they really are.
There's Keith getting his advertising dollars in as
well. Yeah.
All right. So folks, thanks for taking the time out of your day to join us, and we will see you again in a month. Take care.